Believe it or not, Canada used to be a great nation. And in today's Basement episode, we're going over the rise and the fall of Canada and how it culminates in today's massive assault weapon ban. In the years before the First World War, Canada operated as a Commonwealth state, growing in size and power as it tapped into its wealth of natural resources. Canada was, for all intents and purposes, the place to be, and some even predicted that Winnipeg, a city in the middle of Canada, could be bigger and more influential than Chicago, even though they're 1,300 kilometers apart. Now, obviously, that never came to fruition because of a new rail connection to Chicago that proved to be more useful than Winnipeg's river access. And now, Winnipeg is only scraping 1 million people, and Chicago is hell on earth. If we look forward a bit to the First World War, the Great War as it was known then, Canada played an influential part all across Europe. Roped into conflict by England, Canadian soldiers fought with fervor and zeal against everything the Germans could throw at them. They urinated on handkerchiefs and wore them around their noses to fight against the first use of chlorine gas in the war. They took heavy losses and returned to fight again, and they became so terrifying the enemy would run if they even thought Canadians were coming to fight against them. They pioneered and perfected strategies to engage in trench warfare like the world had never seen before, and they won the war because of it. In the Second World War, Canada had a different task. Airplanes had become faster, more maneuverable, and more capable of delivering ordnance on the enemy, but pilots were in short supply. So, England had Canada train the pilots of every Commonwealth nation except for England herself, and Canada turned out the best pilots of the war for every nation who needed them. And they were in the war since the beginning, and they stayed in the fight until the war was done and Japan had surrendered. In part because of the war contribution, and because they're growing as an economic powerhouse, Canada became a more independent nation. While they remained a part of the Commonwealth and shared a monarch, Canada made their own decisions and flew their own flag. Canada also fought in the Cold War, both in proxies like Korea and on the home front, being the earliest warning lines to Russian attacks over the North Pole. And through Canada's rich history of bravery, strength, and independence, you'd think such a nation would maintain its position of power on the world stage. But you'd be wrong. And Canada has proved it only takes 9 years to bring a country from a position of strength to becoming a nation of weakness. Canada has been on this path of destruction since 2015, when Justin Trudeau, son of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, won the majority of the Canadian Parliament. Quickly, he set about breaking Canada, giving into the hedonistic whims of insane liberals legalizing marijuana across the country. You might think this is a non-issue, but it rapidly becomes a problem because of the precedent that this set. The precedent that drugs are okay. And we're going to get back to this, but first let's talk about money. You see, for the previous few decades before Trudeau's takeover, Canada had generally been reducing their debt. It had been quite high, and it was a huge problem, and liberal and conservative leaders all over the country were working together to reduce spending and reduce the national debt load on Canadians. The trend of decreasing debt was broken under the tenure of Stephen Harper, who had been in control of the Conservatives for a few years already. The debt increased, and significantly, and the reason is because of the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession, and the Conservatives had begun curbing the 6 years of deficits and were still again lowering the debt of Canadians across the board. But the Liberals took over before too many fixes could be implemented, and like clockwork, the debt went up dramatically. Naturally, over COVID, the debt skyrocketed, as it did for many countries. Now, in the year of our Lord 2024, things have gone down, but only returned to the trend line, which means it's still higher than it was pre-COVID times. So even without COVID, Canadians' living capability would be quite similar to where it is today, with or without COVID, all because of Trudeau's Liberals. Speaking of COVID, that was a huge point of abuse for Trudeau's Liberals. Now, Justin Trudeau is no stranger to scandal, and they've been plaguing his government since the beginning. But because of the unprecedented nature of COVID, what he got away with went largely unchecked. His government appropriated millions of dollars to an immigration control app and awarded the contract to certain friends of certain politicians, as well as contracting a minister's company for PPE with taxpayer funds. All that and so much more that we just don't have time to get into. Some of the issues from 3 or 4 years ago are only now coming to light because the Liberals were trying to prevent them from being investigated, but are slowly failing. Through the world-famous trucker protests, Justin Trudeau also enacted martial law. Now, martial law has a purpose, but only in times of intense conflict, not like it is in South Korea right now. An entirely peaceful protest, such as the trucker protest, doesn't count as intense conflict, but Because Trudeau enacted martial law, and because of the martial law, the government deployed riot police on horseback to trample and corral protesting families, as well as freeze bank accounts of any Canadian they chose. And, conveniently, the crowdfunding site used to help these protesters, Give Send Go, was hacked and revealed all the names and addresses of everyone who donated. Thankfully, not all of them were frozen because that would have affected myself, but that doesn't mean that Thankfully, not all of them were frozen, but that doesn't mean people weren't affected, and many actually were. The last big power grab of COVID was the first assault weapon ban of 2020, with the Liberal government banned AR-15s and many other assault-style weapons. No matter. While AR-15s and functionally identical rifles are very popular, that didn't remove all semi-auto rifles from the picture. And in fact, despite the increase in regulations, Canadian firearm manufacturers got creative and found a way around the AR-15, AR-10, and AK platform bans, particularly moving towards a gas piston AR-180 style platform. A couple years later, in 2022, the Liberal government topped their sweeping gun control legislation with Bill C-21, a bill that not only restricted rifles and airsoft guns, but also enacted a national freeze on handguns, with the limited exception of museums as well as military and law enforcement. Think about those exemptions for a moment, and let's move on to 2023. Remember when I said we get back to drugs? So we're right about there now. In early 2023, the city of Vancouver, British Columbia, requested of the federal government that they decriminalize small amounts of hard drugs. The government, as you can imagine, acquiesced to the request and instantly turned Vancouver from Hollywood North into a new San Francisco. Because you see, when you give drugs an inch, they take a mile. It happened with weed back in 2015, and it's happened again with hard drugs in Vancouver. Now, people who are strung out on drugs are a very common sight. Safe injection sites have only made the problem worse, and use of fentanyl-laced drugs is a massive, massive issue. If you're curious about what it's like, I'll link to a short documentary by Tyler Oliveira in the show notes. Warning, it's hard to watch. And despite how bad this has worked out across BC, the Liberal government keeps running the country like it wants everywhere to be that bad. And last, but certainly not least, we get to today's latest demonstration of government overreach. On the day of recording, December 5th, 2024, the government updated the list of guns banned in 2020, adding the GAP guns. Essentially, every gun made to comply with the regulations as effectively as possible. And Canadians and Canadian gun manufacturers had gotten pretty creative. But now, every single one of those guns can no longer be bought, sold, transferred, or even used. Owners can just have them and look at them, and someday the government will seize them and destroy them. Now, I personally understand why they did this, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's scummy. They ban the popular guns, they wait for the companies to figure out the solution, and then they ban those too. Only the most recent guns made in Canada avoided the ban, but it's only a matter of time until those go too. And in the interest of not publicizing which ones, I won't say what they are. And what's ironic about all this is that the seizure that will apparently come actually never will. You see, Canada Post is a crown company, technically government employees, but with some autonomy. The government intended on using Canada Post to transport all these guns until they could be destroyed, but Canada Post refused. And they can, because they have enough autonomy. So this is what a country gets when you have no right to defense. All of Europe should be taking note right now. You have only what you have as long as the government lets you. And because Canadians have no right to bear arms, the government can take away everything from everyone except the government. And all of this is the culmination of where Canada has been headed for years now. As life gets more expensive for Canadians, the government keeps on heaping on taxes and restrictions. Now, you're probably wondering, doesn't Canada have a multi-party system? This must just be the will of the people. And if you believe this, you're right, but you're actually wrong. In America, we have a two-party system, but we also have other smaller parties and independent candidates that have no chance, but they're there. In Canada, there's the Liberals and the Conservatives, and there's the NDP and the Bloc Québécois and the Greens and the Independents. But, unlike Europe, there's only really two parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, with the Liberals holding a minority government right now. Now, the Liberals aren't as free-thinking as you might believe. They vote as one group. Conservatives do the same, and the Bloc does the same. And because the Liberals only have a minority government, they formed a coalition with the NDP, the New Democratic Party. And that adds enough seats for them to have a majority vote, is so long as the NDP votes with the Liberals. Now, even if there was coalition, the NDP would vote like the Liberals because the only difference between the Liberals and the NDP is the NDP can bankrupt the country even faster. And the Bloc Québécois is a separatist state. They don't care about Canada, they only care about Quebec. And lastly, the Greens and the Independents don't make a dent in anything because nobody cares. So while, yes, Canada is a multi-party system, they do effectively the same thing as America's two-party system. Again, this is a warning to Europe and America. Things can go south I guess things can go north very, very quickly. And Americans need to fight for their rights, especially the Second Amendment. Because without the Second Amendment, there is no other rights. And Canadians need to fight as hard as they can to overturn this bill and all the gun bans. Because gun legislation is a very easy way to go from a free country to a very not free country very quickly. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Basement. Please follow us on Spotify and YouTube if you like this video. Thumbs up, leave a review. Music's fading in. I was going to get other people in this episode, but nobody cares. It's just me. So, bye Canada. Goodbye. Bye. Bye.